ESS Ecosystems and Ecology 1 Part 1 has its focus on energy and matter flow through ecosystems. Part 1, this movie, focuses on food chains and food webs, along with an introduction to the dynamic of photosynthesis and respiration. The significant ideas are the interaction of species with their environment results in energy and nutrient flows. Photosynthesis and respiration play a significant role in the flow of energy in communities. And lastly, the feeding relationships of species in a system can be modeled using food chains, food webs, and ecological pyramids. Here's an outline of all of the ecosystems and ecology units. There are two distinct units: Ecosystems and Ecology 1, Ecosystems and Ecology 2. This movie is focused right here. The first IB syllabus statement of the movie is distinguish between the biotic and abiotic components of an ecosystem. The biotic components in an ecosystem are predation, herbivory, parasitism, mutualism, disease, and competition, and most of these terms will be covered in the next unit. The abiotic or physical factors include temperature, sunlight, pH, salinity, and precipitation or rainfall. Here are the abiotic components of an ecosystem, and here are the biotic components in an ecosystem. An ecosystem is a community, different species, and the abiotic factors interacting together in a given location. In this photograph, the ecosystem includes the plants and animals of the desert interacting with each other as animals feed on plants, called herbivory, or animals feed on animals, called predation. And the ecosystem also includes the plants and animals of the desert interacting with the abiotic environment, the lack of rainfall, the high and low temperatures which are typical of a desert. The ecosystem includes rattlesnakes eating rats. This is called predation. And the ecosystem includes the plants and animals of the desert interacting with the abiotic environment, the lack of rainfall, the high and low temperatures. The species of the desert must adapt to the abiotic factors within which they live. The abiotic factors in some ecosystems would include high rainfall and warm temperatures. Some ecosystems, like this tundra at 78 degrees north latitude, have abiotic factors of cold temperatures and low quantities of sunlight. But the community of organisms must interact with those abiotic factors. Keep in mind that the reindeer in the tundra biome would feed on the grasses. This would be called herbivory. The savanna biome has a community of herbivores that feed on the grasses. The community of herbivores on the African savanna also interact with their abiotic environment: hot, dry summers, wet winters, and regular fires. The next two IB syllabus statements are: describe the pathways of radiation through the atmosphere. Describe the pathways of energy through an ecosystem. Solar energy is a significant abiotic factor in all ecosystems because it drives photosynthesis and it warms ecosystems, providing a habitable temperature. As well, solar energy drives the cycling of matter, such as the water cycle. In this image, sunlight streams toward the Earth, and you can see that some of it is reflected back to space from the tops of clouds, say, or from the surface of the Earth. The solar energy absorbed by the Earth's surface can be used for photosynthesis, but a lot of solar energy is simply absorbed by non-living materials, water or ground. Some of the solar energy is absorbed directly by clouds and water vapor in the atmosphere. So from the last slide, remember that solar energy absorbed at the Earth's surface includes the energy that drives photosynthesis. But with this slide, let me just review the pathways of radiation through an ecosystem. They would include the transformation of light energy to chemical energy. This is photosynthesis as light arrives at the ecosystem, and plants or photosynthesizers transform the light energy to that of sugar, chemical energy. There's also the transfer of chemical energy from one trophic level to another, as animals eat plants or animals eat animals. And lastly, there's the transformation of chemical energy to heat, which is the respiration of all organisms everywhere. Take note of the use of the terms transformation and transfer in this slide. In this diagram, you can see the solar energy passing into and through the atmosphere. You can see the reflection here and here and here. You can see the absorption of solar energy at the Earth's surface, and this includes the absorption of energy into the ecosystem by photosynthesis. And lastly, pathways of energy through an ecosystem include the overall conversion of visible light and ultraviolet to heat, and the re-radiation of heat to the atmosphere seen here. Now let's look a little bit more specifically at ecosystems with these two IB syllabus statements. Define the terms population and community, and explain the role of producers, consumers, and decomposers in the ecosystem. A population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same area at the same time and which are capable of interbreeding. A community is a group of populations of different species living and interacting with each other in a common habitat. In this diagram, you can see two food chains, and each chain exists in a community, a group of different species or a group of populations living and interacting with each other in a common habitat. We have a terrestrial food chain in its habitat, and we have a marine food chain and its habitat. Each food chain displays feeding relationships. The trophic level is a position that an organism occupies in a food chain. Organisms that photosynthesize are producers. Producers are plants or algae, phytoplankton, that produce their own food using photosynthesis. And they form the very first trophic level in a food chain. The arrows in each chain represent the flow of energy. So that leads us to these two IB syllabus statements. Define the term trophic level and identify and explain trophic levels in food chains and webs selected from a local environment. This diagram displays a food web involving producers and consumers, and we've defined trophic level as the position an organism occupies in a food chain. Primary producers in most ecosystems convert light energy into chemical energy in the process of photosynthesis. Then the energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next. A food web as a model of feeding relationships better displays the complexity of an ecosystem than does a food chain. For example, many species feed at more than one trophic level. For example, the species here is a third level consumer along this chain, but a second level consumer along this chain. Here is a marine coastal food web that begins with the producers, the autotrophs, labeled green for the photosynthetic transformation of solar energy to chemical energy of glucose. Now the seal is a third level consumer along this food chain, but a second level consumer along this food chain. The top level consumers are really dependent on the success of the levels below them. And this is one reason why the top carnivores are more vulnerable to disturbance than other trophic levels. For example, if limpets were removed from the system, the trophic levels above would do less well. On the other hand, the producers on which the limpets feed would fare better. This is a diagram of a terrestrial food web. You can see the complexity of the system with numerous flows of energy through the system. I'll let you study this diagram on your own. But I would like to make note of the fact that none of the webs that I've shown you so far has displayed a decomposer. Thus, here is an example of how a model, as a simplified representation of reality, lacks accuracy. This diagram displays food chains starting with producers, autotrophs, as you can see here. But this diagram also displays detritivores, which are animals that feed on large pieces of dead material known as detritus. And this diagram also displays decomposers that break down organic material into inorganic material. In this diagram of the African savanna, we can see certain feeding relationships, particularly herbivory with zebra that feed on grasses and elephants that feed on larger plants. We can also see predation when cheetahs feed on zebra, with this arrow meant to represent energy flow. Decomposers are shown in the soil, ready to decompose the large organic molecules of dead organisms into inorganic molecules. So that brings us to these two IB syllabus statements. Describe and explain the transfer and transformation of energy as it flows through an ecosystem. Describe and explain the transfer and transformation of materials as they cycle within an ecosystem. So light enters an ecosystem. It's transformed to chemical energy by the photosynthetic producers. And then the chemical energy is transferred from one trophic level to the next, producer to consumer, consumer to consumer. And at each trophic level, some of the energy is transformed to heat due to the second law of thermodynamics, and heat leaves the ecosystem. Now matter cycles within the system from inorganic to organic and back. Photosynthesis takes carbon dioxide, an inorganic molecule, and transforms carbon dioxide to glucose, an organic molecule. Producer and consumers transform glucose back to carbon dioxide through respiration. So carbon cycles, as does nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, oxygen, hydrogen, etc. within the ecosystem. Autotrophs, producers, transform carbon dioxide into glucose using a photosynthetic transformation of solar energy to chemical energy. Heterotrophs, consumers, feed on autotrophs. This is a transfer of energy and matter as food. Both autotrophs and heterotrophs respire, releasing carbon dioxide back to the environment as an inorganic molecule. And notice how energy enters the system, flows through the system, and then out of the system as heat. Second law of thermodynamics. Matter cycles within the system, but energy flows through the system. So our discussion so far of photosynthesis and respiration brings us to a slightly higher level of detail, and here it is. Describe photosynthesis and respiration in terms of inputs, outputs, and energy transformations. This system diagram displays a forest that transforms carbon dioxide and water into glucose through photosynthesis. The system storage unit of kilograms per area of carbon is representative of a storage. Photosynthesis is a transformation of solar energy to chemical energy, the chemical energy in glucose. Producers, like all organisms everywhere, respire, transforming glucose to carbon dioxide and water. The respiration of glucose is a transformation of energy from chemical energy to heat, and heat is transferred out of the system. The inputs of photosynthesis are carbon dioxide and water. The outputs of photosynthesis are glucose and oxygen. The inputs of respiration are glucose and oxygen, while the outputs of respiration are carbon dioxide and water. Both reactions are transformations. In this model of a plant system in green, we can see solar radiation arriving, some of which is immediately reflected. This is a transfer. Solar radiation is absorbed, carbon dioxide is taken in, and together transformed into the chemical energy of glucose by photosynthesis. The first law of thermodynamics conserves energy. Despite the transformation, the amount of solar energy absorbed is equal to the amount of chemical energy in glucose. That's the first law. In turn, the plant will transform some of its glucose for its own energy needs, releasing carbon dioxide and heat. The second law of thermodynamics demands that whenever energy is transformed, some of it proceeds to a less ordered form, heat. The entropy of the system increases. Photosynthetic organisms, producers, transform light energy into chemical energy in the process of photosynthesis. Photosynthesis produces the raw material for producing biomass. Respiration results in the release of energy, a transfer of energy as heat out of the system. Respiration increases the entropy in the ecosystem, allowing organisms to maintain order, high organization. In other words, organisms have low entropy. The chlorophyll of producers, autotrophs, absorb visible wavelengths, to transform solar radiation and CO2 into the chemical energy of glucose. The food of plants becomes available to consumers. Chemical energy is transferred to consumers as food. Producers and consumers both respire, transforming glucose into carbon dioxide, seen here for the producer and here for the consumer. Ultimately, heat is transferred out of the system. This is an excellent diagram to study. Notice the magnitude, the size of the flows and the storages in an attempt to accurately represent the amount of energy in each location. You can see the total energy into the system is equal to the energy out, despite the transformations. This is the first law of thermodynamics. Again, the first law is seen that the amount of energy in the herbivores is equal to the energy going out as heat, energy to the decomposers, and energy going to the carnivores. Work this kind of analysis throughout this food chain. You can do this yourself. The second law is seen in the transformation of energy from a high quality input of solar radiation to a less ordered form of energy, or heat. The entropy of the system increases as heat is less able to do work in the system and leaves the system. Here's a diagram of the carbon cycle. Producers, plants or algae, phytoplankton, take up the inorganic carbon dioxide and solar radiation from the atmosphere during photosynthesis to build the organic material of the plant. The chemical energy of the organic plant material is moved through the food chain from primary consumer to secondary consumer, from detritivore to decomposer, and all organisms everywhere, consumers, plants, and decomposers, transform organic molecules back to the inorganic through respiration, releasing CO2 back to the atmosphere and heat out to the universe. Here is a different model of the carbon cycle. Notice that the units are in moles. Storages are standing stocks, while flows are rates. You can see the process of photosynthesis here, the uptake of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere by producers. This is a transformation labeled red. Feeding, the transfer of chemical energy from producer to consumer, is here. The blue flow is a transfer. Both producers and consumers respire carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere, a transformation. Producers and consumers will die, a transfer to the soil, but decomposers will transform the organic molecules of dead organisms into the inorganic of carbon dioxide through respiration, releasing carbon dioxide back to the atmosphere. Organic carbon in the soil can be buried to form rock or fossil fuels, mostly transformation processes. Humans pump organic fossil fuels from the ground, a transfer called mining, and then combust fossil fuels, a transformation, releasing carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. I've spent a lot of time talking about aerobic respiration and the requirement for oxygen, but as a last note of somewhat high detail, I'd like to mention that not all respiration happens in the presence of oxygen, and when there is no oxygen, the process is called anaerobic respiration. And the interesting thing about anaerobic respiration is that the products are something other than carbon dioxide. In particular, methane is a product of an anaerobic respiration process. Just keep this in the back of your mind. We'll be picking this idea up when we look at greenhouse gases and climate change. Hopefully at this point you feel comfortable with these IB syllabus statements, define the terms population and community, explain the role of producers, consumers, and decomposers in the ecosystem. Hopefully you can identify all of the flows shown in this simple diagram of a community system. And can you identify which flows are transformations and which are transfers? Turn the movie off now or follow along with me. The purple flow is photosynthesis, a transformation. The red flow is feeding, a transfer. The green flows represent death, heading in the direction of decomposers. These are transfers. The blue flows represent respiration, transformation. The pink flow is decomposition, a transformation. The orange flow is the uptake of inorganic nutrients from the soil by plants, a transfer. And that brings us to the end of IB ESS Ecosystems and Ecology 1, Part 1.